Maigret and the Spinster by George Simenon. Part 3, Chapter 1.
It was still raining the following morning. The rain was soft, cheerless, and hopeless, like a widow's tears. It could be felt rather than seen, although it spread over everything like a cold layer of varnish and dotted the sand with countless little vibrant circles. Those starting out for work as late as 9 o'clock might well have imagined that they were in time to catch the milk train, with the gas lamps still alight in the lingering darkness. Maigret, as he reached the top of the stairs at police headquarters, glanced involuntarily at the aquarium and could not shake off the feeling that he would see Cecile sitting there in her usual place, humble and resigned, as she had been on her last visit. An ugly thought had formed in his mind this morning. He could not imagine why. No doubt, as he walked along half asleep, sheltering close to the walls of dripping houses, the girl in the movie house, Nushi, and Monsieur Charles had flitted like shadows across his consciousness. And now, in the corridor leading to his office, it occurred to him to wonder whether Cecile and Monsieur Duchemin. He had no grounds for any such suspicion. It was distasteful to him. It sullied his recollections, and yet the chief superintendent's thoughts kept reverting to it. Wait a minute, there's someone. The chief commissioner would like to see you at once. It was the guard, who was preventing Maigret from going into his own office. Did you say there was someone in there? He asked. A minute or so later, he was knocking at the chief commissioner's door. Come in, Maigret. Feeling better? Look, I've taken the liberty of using your office as a waiting room for a visitor. I couldn't think where else to put him. Besides, it's your pigeon, really. Here, read this. Maigret stared blankly at the proffered visiting card, which read, Jean Tonchant, Minister of State at the Foreign Office. Begs the Chief Commissioner of the Police Judiciaire to give every assistance to Monsieur Spencer Oats of the Institute of Criminology of Philadelphia, who has been highly recommended to us by the United States Embassy. What does he want? To study your methods. And the Chief Commissioner could not help laughing as he watched Maigret stride away, with shoulders hunched and fists clenched, for all the world as if he were bent on pounding the American criminologist to a pulp. I'm delighted to meet you, Chief Superintendent. One moment, Monsieur Spencer. Hello, switchboard. Maigret speaking. Any messages for me? He hasn't been found yet. Get me Berger 19. Quite a likable fellow, this American. A tall, scholarly-looking young man, with red hair and a thin face, wearing a sober suit of good cut, and speaking with a slight, rather pleasant accent. Is that you, Berger? Well, nothing, Chief. He bedded down on the divan, fully dressed. I must say I'm feeling hungry, and there isn't a thing to eat in the flat. I daren't take the risk of slipping out to buy some croissant. Will you be coming soon? No. He's as good as gold. He even went so far as to say he didn't blame you, and that he'd have done the same in your place. He's quite confident that you will soon realize you have made a mistake. Maigret hung up and went across to his stove, which he proceeded to light, much to the surprise of the American. What can I do for you, Monsieur Spencer? He deliberately chose to call him by his Christian name because he had not the least idea how to pronounce Oats. To begin with, Chief Superintendent, I should very much like to hear your views on the psychology of the murderer. Maigret, meanwhile, had picked up his mail from his desk and was opening it. Which murderer? He asked, glancing through his letters. Why, murderers in general. Before or after? What do you mean? Maigret smoked his pipe, read his letters, warmed his back, and seemed to attach no importance to this disjointed interchange. What I mean is, are you referring to murderers before or after they have committed the crime? Because, needless to say, before they are not yet murderers. For 30, 40, 50 years of their lives, longer sometimes, they are just people like anyone else, aren't they? Of course. At long last, Maigret looked up and, with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, said, What makes you think, Monsieur Spencer, that just killing one of his own kind should change a man's character from one minute to the next? He went over to the window and gazed up at the little circles on the sand. "So what it really comes down to," said the American, "is that the murderer is a man like any other." There was a knock on the door. Lucas came in, carrying a file of papers. Catching sight of the Pfister, he seemed about to beat a retreat. "What is it, my boy?" "Ah, yes. Well then, you'd better take the file across to the DPP's office. I take it the Hotel des Arcades is still under surveillance." Lucas brought him up to date on the Polish case, but Maigret had not lost the thread of his argument. "Why does a man commit murder, Monsieur Spencer? From motives of jealousy, greed, hatred, envy. Sometimes, though more rarely, from necessity. In other words, he may be driven by any one of the human passions. Now, every one of us is subject to these passions to a greater or lesser degree. My neighbor invariably opens his window on summer nights and blows his hunting horn. Consequently, I hate him, but I very much doubt if I shall murder him. And yet, only last month, a retired colonial servant, whose temper had been shortened by recurring bouts of tropical fever, fired a shot at the man who lived in the apartment above him, because he had a wooden leg and would insist on pacing up and down all night, pounding the floorboards. I can see what you mean, but what about the psychology of the murderer afterward? That's no concern of mine. That's a matter of juries and prison governors and guards. My job is to find the culprit, and for that purpose, all that concerns me is his personality before the act, whether he had it in him to commit that particular murder, and how and when he committed it. The Chief Commissioner gave me to understand that you might perhaps allow me to be present at... He wouldn't be the first, so much the worse for him. I know you're working on the Berger case, and I have followed the newspaper reports with great interest. Do you know already who did it? I know who did it, at any rate, all the same. Allow me to ask you a question. Monsieur Spencer, a man believes himself to be a suspect. Rightly or wrongly, he imagines the police are in possession of evidence incriminating him. His wife is expecting a child at any moment. There isn't so much as a penny in the house. This man rampages into his sister's flat like a madman, demanding money, every penny she's got. His sister gives him 130 francs. What does he do with it? And Maigret pushed the newspaper across the desk to his Pfister. It was the evening paper of the previous day, with the photograph of Maigret laying his hand on Gerhard Pardon's shoulder. Is this the young man? That's him. Last night, from this office, I broadcast his description to all police stations up and down the country. A watch is being kept on all frontiers. 130 francs. Are you saying he's innocent? I'm convinced that he's not guilty of the murder of either of his aunt or his sister. If he had asked for the money earlier in the day, I would have concluded that he wanted it to buy a revolver to shoot himself. But he's innocent. Precisely, Monsieur Spencer. That's the point I'm trying to make. An innocent man may have the seeds of guilt in him, just as a guilty man may be innocent at heart. Luckily, by the time the boy got hold of the 130 francs, the gunsmiths had already put up their shutters. I presume, therefore, that he's on the run. So the question is, how far could he go with 130 francs? Just about across the Belgian frontier. He picked up the receiver and asked to be put through to the forensic laboratory. Hello, Maigret here. Who is that speaking? Oh, it's you, Juliette. I want you to get your gear together and rustle up an assistant. Yes, and wait for me downstairs in the taxi. Then, turning to the American, we may be about to make an arrest. You know who did it? I think so, but I'm not sure. To tell the truth, I'd be inclined to. Would you mind waiting for me here for a few minutes, Monsieur Spencer? Maigret went through to the Palais de Justice, making use of the notorious communicating door which should have been bricked up years ago, that same door without which Cecile could not have died where she did. It was so convenient. What good had it done to repeat, year after year, for the past 10 or was it 20 years? The chief superintendent knocked at the examining magistrate's door, but, when invited to take a seat, shook his head. I can't stay. I've got someone waiting for me. What I came for, Judge, was to ask if you wouldn't mind too much if I were to arrest a man who may turn out to be innocent. I should point out, mind you, that he's a nasty type, with a number of convictions for sexual offenses, and he'd scarcely have the nerve to lodge a complaint. In that case, what's his name? Charles Danderhorn. 10 minutes later, Maigret and Spencer Oats got into the taxi on the Quai d'Auvergne, in which the two technicians from the forensic laboratory were waiting. It was shortly after 10 when the taxi drew up at Berger. Juliette Boynet's house was shrouded in a scorched mist, so that it looked blurred and much faded, as in an old photograph. "Wait for me upstairs on the 5th-floor landing," said Maigret to the technicians. He rang Danderhorn's bell. Berger, who had dark rings under his eyes from lack of sleep, came to the door. "Haven't you brought any food?" Monsieur Charles had taken off his collar. He had the crumpled look of a man who has slept in his clothes. He was wearing a pair of old bedroom slippers. "I presume," he began. "I shouldn't presume anything if I were you, Monsieur Danderhorn. You're almost sure to get it wrong. I have here a warrant for your arrest, duly signed by the examining magistrate assigned to the case." "Ah, you don't sound surprised." "No, I'm sorry for you, that's all." "Have you nothing to say before you leave? You will be kept in custody at the Centre. All I have to say is that you are making a mistake." "Aren't you forgetting what you did yesterday in Juliette Boynet's bedroom while I was on the telephone here?" A bitter smile flickered over the unshaven face of the man. "Stay with him, Berger. See that he gets dressed. When he's ready, take him to the Préfecture and book him." Abruptly, he turned around, seized the kid by her thin shoulders, and said angrily, "Listen to me, Duchy. If you get under my feet just once more—" "What will you do to me?" she asked, thrilled. "You'll see, and it will be no joke. Be off with you." He went upstairs and proceeded to open the door of the 5th-floor apartment. "Now, this is what I want you fellows to do. Careful, Monsieur Spencer, don't go in there." "But we've already fingerprinted the whole apartment," objected the photographer. "On the day after the murder, quite right, and only 2 sets of prints were found in Juliette Boynet's bedroom, her own and Cecile's. There were no men's fingerprints, none of Gerhard Pardon's, and none of that sorry rogue's downstairs. But it so happens that last night, while I was speaking on the phone in his study, he came into this room. I'm sure of that because I could hear his footsteps. I don't know what he was up to, but he was taking a grave risk, so he must have had some very compelling reason. I want you to find out what he touched, so get going. Now, do you see why I asked you not to go into that room, Monsieur Spencer?" The technicians had set up their apparatus and were getting down to the job. Maigret, his hands in his pockets, wandered from room to room. "It's not a very pretty story, is it? A miserly, crazy old woman, a girl, or rather a somewhat faded young woman, none too generously endowed by nature. Will you come downstairs for a moment?" They reached Monsieur Charles' apartment just as he was leaving, wearing a hat and coat, in company with Inspector Berger. "Don't worry about your things, Monsieur Danderhorn. I'll take charge of the key to your apartment. Incidentally, you will presumably be appointing a lawyer very shortly to represent you. I shall expect to see him here." Whereupon he shut the door and went not into the study of the former lawyer, but into his bedroom. "Take a seat, Monsieur Spencer. Listen. You can hear every word that is said up there. Correct. I don't know what your new houses are like in America, but ours are about as soundproof as cigar boxes. Pay no attention to their footsteps. See if you can make out what they were doing. It sounds as if that's odd. It's much more difficult. I agree with you. There, now, someone is fiddling with a drawer. He's opening it. But can you tell which drawer it is? It's not possible. Right, that settles one point. From his own apartment, Danderhorn could hear every word that was spoken on the floor above. He could judge more or less where everyone in Juliette Boynet's household happened to be at any given time. On the other hand, the precise details of who was doing what. I only hope that idiot Gerhard hasn't thrown himself into the Seine. But you say he's innocent. I said I believed he was. Unfortunately, I'm not invaluable. I also pointed out that innocent people often behave as if they were guilty. I hope Bertha is still with his wife. At any moment, she may give birth to a bouncing boy. Above their heads, furniture was being dragged across the floor. If you were a miser, Monsieur Spencer, there are no misers in the States. Miserliness is a characteristic of a mature civilization. We haven't reached that stage yet. In that case, let us suppose that you are an old woman, an old French woman. You are in possession of millions, and yet your lifestyle is no more lavish than that of any widow living on a small fixed income. I find that difficult to imagine. Make an effort. Your only pleasure in life is counting the bills that represent your life savings. That is the problem that has haunted me for the past few days, because you see, a man's life depends upon it. Find where the money is hidden and you find the killer. I suppose, began the American. You suppose what? Interrupted Maigret, almost aggressively. If I were such a person as you've described, I would keep my money where I could readily lay my hands on it at all times. That's exactly what I thought. But wait, although considerably handicapped, Juliette Boynet was nevertheless able to get around in the apartment. She would stay in bed in the mornings until about 10, when her niece would bring in her breakfast and the morning paper. Maybe she hid the money in her bed. I seem to have heard somewhere that it's common practice in France to sew one's savings into one's mattress. The only thing is that for the rest of the day, until she returned to bed at night, Juliette spent her time in the sitting room. Just before she died, she had 800,000 francs in the house, in 1,000-franc bills. That many bills would be quite bulky. Now, listen carefully. There are only two people who could have known where that money was hidden. The old woman's niece, Cecile, who lived with her. She was not in her aunt's confidence, but she might accidentally have. Monsieur Danderhorn, on the other hand, was in the old lady's confidence, wasn't he? Only to some extent. You can take it from me, he didn't know where she kept the money. Women like Juliette Boynet don't trust anybody, not even their guardian angels. Still, as you yourself have noticed, you can't make a sound up there that isn't heard in this room. Let's go up, shall we? If the telephone rings, we shall hear it. It was such a humid day that the banister rail was sticky to the touch. In the piano teacher's apartment, a pupil was playing scales. The Hungarians were quarreling, and Nucci's shrill voice was clearly to be heard. Well, boys, it's amazing, Chief. What is? Are you sure the fellow wasn't wearing rubber gloves? I know for certain he wasn't. He walked on the carpet, but up to now we haven't found any sign that he touched anything, apart from the door knob. In fact, the only prints we've found are yours. A powerful spotlight had been plugged into the outlet. The presence of cameras gave a different feel to the room which Juliette Boynet had occupied for so many years. She used a cane, didn't she? The American asked suddenly. Maigret whipped around as if he had been stung. Wait, what was the one thing that the old woman could take with her everywhere? From her bedroom into the sitting room, and from there into the dining room at meal times. Her cane, of course. But it would not be possible to hide 800,000 francs in 1,000-franc bills in a cane, even if it were hollow. The chief superintendent took another searching look at the contents of the room. What about this? He asked suddenly, pointing to a small, low, box-like object, covered in worn tapestry, which Juliette Boynet had probably used as a footstool. Any prints? Not a thing, Chief. Maigret picked it up and put it on the bed. He felt along the row of brass studs securing the tapestry, and was able to raise the top, which formed a kind of lid. The interior was lined with a copper receptacle, and had obviously been intended originally as a foot warmer, to be filled with charcoal. There was a silence. Everyone was staring at a parcel, wrapped in an old newspaper, which was wedged into the copper liner. The 800 bills must be in here, said Maigret at last, relighting his pipe. Look, Monsieur Spencer, and please don't mention this to your colleagues at the Institute of Criminology. It would be too embarrassing. I had the mattress ripped open and the box spring taken apart. I had the walls tapped and the floorboards and the fireplace. And it never occurred to me that an old woman with swollen legs, having to hobble about on a cane, might have this footling little bit of furniture taken from room to rest her feet on. Careful with that newspaper. You fellows had better give it a thorough going over. Maigret, wrapped in his own thoughts, spent the next 10 minutes setting all the clocks right, as a result of which they all chimed one after another. "We're done, Chief." "Eyes prints on it." "They are. As for the bills, there are 810 of them. I shall need envelopes and sealing wax." When the whole of the little fortune was safely under seal, he telephoned the public prosecutor's office and arranged for a senior official to come and collect it. "Will you come with me, Monsieur Spencer?" Outside in the street, he turned up the collar of his overcoat. "It's a pity we didn't keep the taxi, but believe it or not, if I'm terrified of anyone, it's those fellows in our accounts department. I don't know if they're as ferocious over expenses in the United States. How about dropping into that bistro over there for a glass of something while we're waiting for our streetcar? It's where all the local workmen eat, but you've left your hat behind." "I never wear a hat." The chief superintendent stared hard at the shock of red hair spattered with glistening beads of rain. There were no two ways about it. Some things Maigret would never understand. "I'll have a Calvados. What about you?" Would they have such a thing as a glass of milk, I wonder? Maybe that explained how a man of 35 had managed to retain a complexion as rosy as the muzzle of a young calf. "A large glass, barman." "Of milk?" "No, of Calvados." Painstakingly, Maigret pushed fresh tobacco into the bowl of his pipe. Had that cold-blooded scoundrel Duchemin returned 800,000 francs to their hiding place in the old woman's footstool, and thereby put his life in jeopardy?
Maigret and the Spinster by Georges Simenon. Part 3, Chapter 2.
The two men had just left the office of the registrar. At first, Maigret's inquiries had been met with a curt refusal to divulge information from a clerk with bad teeth. When the chief superintendent had produced his badge, however, the man had responded with such feverish zeal that it had taken him twice as long as necessary to search through the bulky volumes of the register. The town hall was neither old nor new. It was ugly as a whole, ugly in every part, ugly in its proportions and in the materials used in its construction. The clock was just striking 12 when Maigret and his American friend, along with most of the town hall staff, emerged from the building. The gentleman with the bulging stomach, 3 chins, and slovenly appearance, whom everyone treated with deference, was presumably none other than the mayor of Berger. The chief superintendent and his companion stood for a moment at the top of the 4 or 5 steps leading up to the portico, waiting for a lull in the heavy downpour of rain. In the little square, sheltered by skeleton trees, the market was packing up. The stalls were being dismantled. The slimy ground was littered with rubbish. Opposite was a butcher's shop, stained with blood from the carcasses. A fat, rosy-cheeked woman could be seen behind the cash counter. Children from a nearby school were being let out for their midday break. They scampered about, shrieking. Many of them were wearing shoes with wooden soles. A green and white bus went by. The atmosphere was neither that of the metropolis nor that of a small provincial town or village. Maigret stole a glance at the American, and their eyes met. Spencer Oats seemed to read his thoughts, because his mouth twitched in a faint smile. In the rain, his face appeared a little veiled, like the scene before them. "We have dreary places like this at home as well," he murmured. The inquiries they had just completed at the town hall could have been entrusted to the most lowly inspector, or indeed to a policeman of the lowest rank. First of all, Maigret had wanted to find out how long Charles Duchemin had lived in his present apartment as a tenant of Juliette Boynet. He had been there just 14 years. Before that, he had occupied a furnished apartment on Rue de l'Ombre, near Boulevard Montparnasse. And the contractor Boynet, Juliette's late husband, had died 6 months before Duchemin moved in. The two men, sheltering in the porch of the building, were waiting for the rain to subside. "Tell me, Monsieur Spencer, do you know why criminals prefer to have dealings with one of us rather than an examining magistrate? I think I'm beginning to get an inkling. I don't deny that we play it rough at times, less so than is generally supposed, but much more so than any examining magistrate or public prosecutor's deputy. On the other hand, it is impossible to conduct a police inquiry without, to some extent, entering into the life of the accused. We visit him in his home. We become familiar with his house, his habits, his family, and his friends. This morning I drew a distinction between the murderer before and after. Well then, you could say that all our efforts are directed toward getting to know the murderer as he was before. Once we hand him over to the examining magistrate, our work is done. All connection with his former life as an ordinary man is severed, usually forever. He is a criminal and nothing but a criminal, and is treated as such by the judiciary. And without a pause, Maigret went on with a sigh. I'd give a lot to know what Charles d'Onderhorn was doing in Juliette's bedroom. Was he putting the bills back in the footstool, or it seems to be clearing up a little? They emerged from the shelter of the porch, the chief superintendent with his shoulders hunched and his hands in his pockets, the American as unconcerned as if the sun was shining. Would you mind having lunch at a bistro? On the contrary, I should be delighted. So far, I have been shepherded about by the officials of my embassy and have eaten only in the smartest restaurants. They took a streetcar to the Porte d'Orléans, going past the wedge-shaped house, its bricks darkened by the rain. The problem is to be able to put oneself in their place, to think and feel as they do. This is even harder for a judge, whose life is of necessity remote. The apartment house where I live isn't so very different from this one. Here we are. The restaurant chosen by Maigret was in a little side street. It had no frills, just a sink counter, a few marble-topped tables, and sawdust on the floor. The proprietor, a pleasant man with a florid, somewhat blotchy complexion, wearing a blue denim apron, came and shook hands with the chief superintendent. It's ages since you last came to see us. Wait till my old woman hears about this. Melanie, have you got that special for Monsieur Maigret? Melanie, pot-bellied, wiping her hands on her apron, emerged from the kitchen. If only you'd called to say you were coming. Oh well, never mind. Here's coq au vin and some quite good cépes, fresh from the country this morning. I hope your friend likes cépes. The place was empty, except for a few regulars. The windows were so steamed up that it was impossible to see out of them. Your usual Beaujolais, Monsieur Maigret? Maigret went to make a telephone call. The American watched him through the glass panes of the cramped little booth as he dialed the number, looking grave and preoccupied. That idiot Gerhard hasn't been found yet, he said when he returned to their table. I'll look in on his wife tonight. I think you mentioned that they are hard up. That has been attended to, of course. I wonder if that child will ever learn of the circumstances surrounding its birth. But what I should dearly like to know is why the hell Charles d'Onderhorn? Whatever else he might talk about, it was plain that he was obsessed with this one question. Why did d'Onderhorn? If he killed the old lady, ventured Spencer Oats, if he killed the old lady, then I'm a bigger fool than you take me for, Monsieur Spencer, and I'll have to start the whole inquiry again from scratch. To begin with, why should he have killed her? She was worth more to him alive than dead. He knew he could expect nothing from her heirs. As for stealing the 800,000 francs from her apartment, you saw for yourself that he didn't. And besides, how could he have done it? She indicated that their interview was at an end. She saw him to the door, and I'm quite sure she locked it carefully behind him. He says she bolted it, and I believe him. She returned to her bedroom. She undressed. She was sitting on her bed and had already taken off one of her stockings when... No, Monsieur Spencer, it wasn't d'Onderhorn. He didn't go back upstairs or open the front door or... And yet, 4 days later, he didn't hesitate, almost in my presence, to bring suspicion on himself by going back into that room. What for? Remember that the old woman's papers, receipts, property deeds, all the documents she kept in the desk in her sitting room, in fact, none of any value to her murderer, since he couldn't make use of them without giving himself away, have vanished. The bills, on the other hand, which in theory at least are untraceable, were left in their hiding place. Even if they were removed for a short while, they were subsequently put back. How do you like these cépes à la Bordelaise? Your mind must be on other things, if I may say so, Chief Superintendent. or you would have noticed that I have already had 3 helpings, and if I hadn't been promised coq au vin to follow, as for the Beaujolais, all I can say is that if you find me rather a dull companion this afternoon, you'll know why. Wait till you've tasted the coq au vin. The proprietress worked 20 years as cook for a cabinet minister. He came to a dubious end, but he did appreciate good cooking. Would you believe that Juliette was quite a beauty in her day? There's a photograph of her in the apartment. I wonder if, by any chance, her husband was a jealous man. Having said this, he became once again lost in thought, from which he did not emerge until the proprietress came to the table to inquire whether the coq au vin had been to his liking. Every now and then, Maigret would glance toward the door. Are you expecting someone? I'm expecting a visit from a gentleman who is not one of my favorite characters. Apparently, he's done nothing but hang around the Cassieux for the past 2 days. I've arranged for him to meet me here. A few minutes later, a taxi drew up outside. Maître Leloup, fat and self-important, paid the driver and came into the bistro. I've brought those papers I mentioned, as promised, he announced, putting down his leather briefcase on an unoccupied table. As you will see presently, my valued client, Monsieur Monfils, was not exaggerating when he claimed. The lawyer had probably had no lunch, but the chief superintendent did not invite him to share their meal, nor did he suggest that he should take off his coat. I'll look into all that later. How is the case progressing? Slowly, Maître Leloup, slowly. May I venture to draw your attention to one point which may have escaped your notice? Please don't imagine for one moment that I'm criticizing the methods for which you are justly famous. But I, for my part, have not been idle. I made it my business to send someone to Fontenay, a thoroughly reliable man, to interview various elderly persons who had known Madame Boynet as a girl, when she was still Juliette Casanova. Maigret, unimpressed, went on eating. He seemed to take no interest in what was being said. The American, watching, could not make him out. I learned 1 or 2 things which I think will surprise you. At this point, almost under his breath, the chief superintendent murmured, I very much doubt it. Juliette Casanova had the reputation of being a rather flighty girl, at least in her conduct with men. And she is reputed to have been the mistress of Charles d'Anderhorn, is that it? Who told you? Nobody told me, but I thought it probable. The d'Anderhorn was about 10 years older than she was. No doubt, even as long ago as that, he had developed a taste for unripe fruit. It created quite a scandal at the time. Not such a scandal, apparently, as to prevent Juliette from marrying her building contractor and moving with him to Paris. None of this is news to me, Maître Leloup. What do you make of it? I don't make anything of it. It's too soon to jump. There's the telephone. I bet you it's for me. Wearing an eager expression, he hurried to the phone. The call must have been for him, because he was away for some minutes. He came back looking relieved. Let's have some more of your coq au vin, patron. He realized suddenly that up to now he had barely touched his food. He was feeling quite peckish. He drank a whole glass of Beaujolais and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. His eyes sparkled. They found Gerard, he said at last, with a sigh. Poor kid. Why do you say poor kid? Because he's been behaving like the idiot he is. Another bottle, Desiree. Would you believe it? He tried to get to the Belgian frontier by train, just as I said he would. When he got there, he found that the carriages were being searched more thoroughly than usual. He lost his head and jumped out of the train on the wrong side. He started running across the fields, stumbling through puddles and mud, with the police force close at his heels. He made a dash for the first farm he came to. Can you guess where they found him when they caught up with him at last, after searching for an hour? In the laboratory. He resisted so violently that they practically had to knock him out. They're bringing him back to Paris. His train is due in at 3:50. Has he confessed? Asked Maître Leloup. Disingenuously, Maigret retorted. Confess to what? Good God, I almost forgot the most important thing. I'd be obliged to you, Maître, if you would send a telegram to your client on my behalf, in view of the good relations between him and his Aunt Boynet. I've been wondering whether she ever put anything in his safekeeping which she would have found embarrassing to keep in her apartment. Don't ask me what. I have no idea. Maybe she used to send him presents. I simply can't wait to hear. At last they were rid of the pestilential lawyer. They could savor Mélanie's coffee and Desirée's old Armagnac in peace. Desiree had come originally from the Gers region, and he had kept in touch with his old friends, many of whom owned vineyards. By now, they had the clean, plainly furnished little restaurant, with its steamy windows all to themselves. The table had been wiped and was now covered with the documents furnished by the lawyer. They were all letters, handwritten on the black-edged paper used by Juliette Boynet after she became a widow. My dear cousins, thank you for your good wishes, which I heartily reciprocate. It is a sad state of affairs when an old woman like me finds herself surrounded by ungrateful people. When I think of all I have done for my sister's children, and how... As Maigret finished reading each of the letters, he handed it to his companion, who glanced through it in his turn. They were all alike, all dated the 2nd or 3rd of January, since each was in reply to Morphy's New Year greetings. They can afford to be patient, believing as they do that they will one day inherit all I have. And elsewhere, Gerhard is a good-for-nothing who never comes near me except to ask for money, as if it grew on trees. Bertha fared no better. It's a great relief to have her off my hands. There was always the risk that she might be put into a condition, and think of the talk that would have caused among the neighbors. A condition, echoed Mr. Oats, puzzled. An interesting condition. It's a delicate way of saying that she feared that her niece might become pregnant. They felt blissfully warm, with the flavor of the Armagnac on their palates and its aroma in their nostrils. It's a terrible affliction to be alone and helpless, and to realize that all anyone cares about is one's money. I am haunted by the dread that sooner or later some misfortune may befall me. You are fortunate to be living in your quiet little town, free from all the anxieties which are ruinous to one's health. Cecile makes a show of being devoted to me, but she's always ready to take her brother's part against me. And there is another person who is deeply indebted to me, but whom I cannot wholly trust. Maigret pointed out this passage to his companion. There was no one whom she wholly trusted, he murmured. With good reason, surely? Read the rest of it. Luckily for me, I'm not such a fool as they think, and I have taken certain precautions. If anything happens to me, I can promise you they won't profit by it. They, sighed Maigret. As far as she was concerned, they were all tarred with the same brush. Everyone who came near her, all those whom she suspected of envying her for her wealth, including Monsieur d'Antoine. Are you beginning to see? To see what? Maigret smiled. I don't blame you. I'm beginning to talk in innuendo, just as she did. To see what, indeed? I should have said feel rather than see. I'm afraid you must be feeling let down if, as you mentioned this morning, you were hoping to learn something from my method of work. I've taken you sloshing through puddles, looking up old records in a dreary town hall, and I've fed you on coq au vin. How can I explain myself to you? I feel things. d'Antoine, recently released from prison, comes to Paris and goes into furnished lodgings. He seeks out Juliette, who is not yet a widow. What kind of a man was her husband? We have nothing to go on but old photographs. A man of 45, tall, thick-set, nondescript. Juliette and d'Antoine resume their former relationship. No doubt they meet in d'Antoine's rooms on Rue de l'Ombre. The husband dies, and as soon as he decently can, d'Antoine moves into the same house as his mistress, though the relationship remains a well-kept secret. I can't see why they should have wanted to keep it secret, demurred the American. There was a long silence. Maigret sat gazing at his glass. At length he sighed and drank a mouthful of Armagnac. Then he said abruptly, We shall see. Desiree, the check, if you please. If I get no work done this afternoon, I shall have you and your wife to thank for it. What was that bastard doing in Juliette's bedroom? For God's sake, Monsieur Spencer, can't you help me? Just think, if we could find the right answer to that question. Spencer Oats, like a model secretary, began gathering up the black-edged letters, which were spread out on the table. Taking precautions, he ventured. Precautions? Maigret frowned. Now he came to think of it. Had not the old woman, in one of the letters, mentioned taking certain precautions to safeguard herself against those who were envious of her wealth. She had been mistrustful of everyone, including her former lover. "How did you like the food, Monsieur Maigret?" asked the forthright Mélanie, who treated all her customers, some of whom were celebrities, with motherly familiarity. "You remember that recipe I wrote out for Madame Maigret? Has she tried it yet?" The chief superintendent was not listening. After putting his change in his trouser pocket, he did not even take out his hand, but sat staring at the proprietress's apron in a state of suspended animation. At long last, he said, "What I couldn't make out was why Cecile was killed. Do you see, Monsieur Spencer? Everything else could be explained. It was easy, but Cecile is dead. And sorry, Mélanie, thanks for the lunch. We thoroughly enjoyed it. Even if my friend remembers nothing else, I'm sure it will provide him with a topic of conversation when he goes back to Philadelphia." He was in a highly nervous state. As they walked along the street, he said not a word, and when at last they reached the corner of Avenue d'Orléans, he waved down a taxi. "Quai des Veuves, and hurry." They were almost halfway there when he changed his mind. "Take us to the Gare du Nord first. Intercity arrivals. It's later than I thought." Was it perhaps due to the coq au vin, the Beaujolais, Mélanie's homemade coffee cream cake, and Désirée's armagnac? At any rate, whatever the reason, Spencer Oats was looking at his preoccupied companion with a good deal of affection. In the past few hours, it seemed to him, he had been witnessing a series of metamorphoses. The chief superintendent, huddled in his overcoat, his bowler hat on the back of his head and his pipe clenched between his teeth, had been actually living the lives of all the characters, the perverted, the miserly, the pitiful, in a drama that it was his responsibility to resolve. It may be that, at this very moment, his wife is in labor. His cheeks were flushed, as if he himself were the anxious husband. Maigret was right there on the train, flanked by 2 guards in Gerhard's place. He was beside Bertha, watching over Gerhard's wife. He was in the house in Boclahen, resting his feet on old Juliette's tapestry stool, or on the floor below, in the apartment from which Monsieur Charles could hear everything that went on overhead. Every now and then, when they were held up at a busy crossroads by the white baton of a traffic policeman in a cape, Maigret could catch sight of the moonlight face of an electric clock and, haunted by a sense of time lost, would rise half out of his seat, as if to lighten the driver's load and enable him to cover the ground more quickly. They reached the Gare du Nord just in the nick of time. In fact, they very nearly didn't make it. A crowd of spectators. A policeman was shouting, "Move along there!" Then they caught sight of a thin young man in handcuffs, pushed jerkily forward by 2 policemen, like a horse between the shafts. His trousers were spattered with mud, his raincoat torn, and this feverish, petulant youth, Gerhard, no doubt seemed to the bystanders the very incarnation of the thwarted criminal. His lips trembled when he saw the chief superintendent. "You think you're very clever, I'm sure." Maigret showed his badge to 2 policemen and ushered them into the waiting taxi. They got in with alacrity. They were in a lather. They had been on edge throughout the train journey for fear that their charge might take it into his head to jump out onto the line. "I don't suppose anyone has bothered to inquire after my wife." And big tears trickled from between his swollen eyelids, which he was unable to wipe away because of the handcuffs.
Slovenly. Slovenly. Adjective. Especially of a person or their appearance, untidy and dirty. Disingenuously. Disingenuously. Actor. Of a person or their behavior, slightly dishonest or not speaking the complete truth. Laugher. Laugher. Now, state of agitation or nervous excitement.